And joining us now in the studio are Jeff Savoy, Secretary and Treasurer of the Poe Society of Baltimore, Michael Fallon, Senior Lecturer of Creative Writing, Literature and Composition at UMBC, and Doreen Bolger, Director of the Baltimore Museum of Art. Thanks to everyone for being here. We appreciate it. My first question about Poe is, I don't think of a feel-good writer. Why has the work endured?
Well, I think people like being scared, and Poe really scares you. I mean, I think that, Poe is interesting. The way he tells a story is interesting. The subject matter is interesting. But I really think that Poe scares you. That's one reason.
What, do you see that as the lasting contribution? What was the mark on the literary world, Jeff?
Well, I think the one thing you have to remember is that Poe is not just pouring his life out into his works. Too many people try to read that into it. He's aware of a reader. He's writing for a reader. He wants to enthrall them. And he understood what they were looking for. He had to defend some of the works, saying that you may say it's in bad taste, but it's what readers are looking for. And I think the fact that he's still being read 150 years later shows that he knew what he was talking about.
He's really timeless. He's someone who continues to captivate people to the present day, even though he's from the 19th century, which is really rather unusual.
And it was the form as well as the content in terms of short stories versus longer form writing?
Well, I think that short stories are the thing that Poe was remembered for the most. I mean, it's hard to think of anybody that has had more of an impact on the short story than Poe. I mean, his name comes up. And he influenced, I saw a list of, on the internet, I saw a list of writers that claim to be influenced by Poe. And it's an incredibly long list. And European writers almost all claim him. I mean, Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, claimed to be influenced by Poe. Borges, Dostoevsky, Mallarmé, Baudelaire. I mean, the French, the Germans, and the Russians love him.
Jeff, you just finished editing a collection of Poe's letters. What have we learned? What did you learn in this process?
Well, Poe's a very complex person, and it's difficult to get a real sense of him just reading biographies, just reading through maybe, too many people are trying to find Poe's life in his works again. You read through the letters, you really see someone who is going through all the phases there. I mean, he writes a truly pathetic letter to his Aunt Maria Clem when he's basically proposing to his cousin Virginia. And it's really very revealing. And yet other letters you can see that he's adopting a mask for something he's trying to submit to an editor or someone he's trying to borrow some money from. The letters back and forth between Poe and John Allen, his foster father, are really fascinating because Poe was indebted to John Allen for many things, and you can see the resentment that's also there. And John Allen kind of wanted him to go into business, and Poe certainly did not want to do that. He didn't think John Allen was willing to support him in the thing that he really felt that he needed to do, which was to go into literature.
Let me remind our viewers, if you have a question about the Poe legacy, you can give us a call at the number on the screen or email us by visiting our website at mpt.org. And Doreen, I wanted to talk to you about the intersection of Poe's words and art.
What's really surprising is that Poe's reputation rose so quickly in France. And I think that goes to what Michael was speaking about earlier, how many European writers took up an interest in Poe. And specifically in France, Charles Baudelaire and Stéphane Mallarmé, who were writers who had, in turn, circles of artists around them. My own favorite story is about Paul Gauguin, who is well known for his trips to Tahiti, his fabulous paintings, but also did a portrait of Mallarmé with the raven standing right on his shoulder, looking into his ear.
I think we have that.
We do have an image of that, yes. And the night before Gauguin went to Tahiti, he had an enormous gathering of his friends, and at that gathering, The Raven was read in French right before his departure. And there's something wonderful about a major work by an American writer being the focal point of all these avant-garde French artists in France at that pivotal moment in art history. And it's hard to think of another American writer who had that stature.
We have a bunch of images here, and I don't know if we can just flip through them for a second and see what else we want to comment on. But there's the iconic image of Poe himself, and this is a sketch of Matisse.
Yes. Actually, Henri Matisse was a great fan of Mallarmé, and so he drew Poe's portrait. All of these French artists, of course, had no idea, no direct contact with Poe, who had died around the middle of the 19th century. So they based a lot of their images on daguerreotypes and early prints. And this particular image by Matisse from the Combe collection here at the BMA is wonderful because it's simplified to just the most essential lines, but he really captures Poe's spirit.
And here's one of the classic images, and if we click ahead, there's another one. I noticed he wasn't smiling.
Poe never seems to be smiling, you know, and I think in a way the image of Poe was as intriguing for visual artists as his writing. They were fascinated with him as a man, and we see that continue today. I'm sure you both have innumerable stories about the ways in which people are just fascinated with the story of his life.
To be fair, people very rarely smile in daguerreotypes. It was an uncomfortable process. You had to sit still for a very long time.
It was like looking into a mirror.
The chairs often had these little devices behind them that would hold your head still so that you didn't move for the period of exposure.
Good point.
So it was a very serious, somber
Let me ask this. For people watching who have seen all of the publicity about this 200th birthday and want to read something by Poe. This is a beginner's guide to Poe. Where do you start? What piece do you recommend? Do you go right to The Raven, or what stands out for you?
The Cask of Amontillado.
And
It's
why?
a terrific story. Well, to me, it's a beautifully, beautifully written story, first of all. It's funny. It's darkly funny. It's very funny. And it's scary. If you read it out loud, I think the beauty of his prose just really comes through.
Is there, at the other end of the spectrum, is there a piece that's less accessible, maybe, more intricate, something that you don't want to start with?
I would not start with Eureka.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier.
That was the thing Poe really wanted to be remembered for, but it's a very complex theory of cosmology, and although there are a lot of people who are in astronomy today who hold it in some respect, it's a very sort of mystical, strange piece.
Now, Mike, I'm sorry, Doreen.
I like the stories really where he concentrates on fear and terror. These wonderful abysses that exist in the ocean, in the Descent into the Maelstrom, or Manuscript in a Bottle, that really encapsulate all of the fears you have, you know, about that big dark ocean out there. You could just be sucked into it. Or the Pit and the Pendulum, which takes up really a victim who's been condemned by the Inquisition and thrown into a cell with a large abyss in the center of it. So I think that a lot of those, to me, are wonderful because they really do capture the deep fears we have as children and even as adults.
I'd certainly second the Cask of Amontillado, which is probably my favorite of the Poe stories. The Telltale Heart is certainly just eminently readable.
Great story.
The other public perception, I guess, is that Poe was a pretty disturbed individual. True? Exaggerated?
Well, it's true that people see him as that, and a lot of that is because, again, they're trying to read Poe into his stories. But again, they're only looking at the handful of stories that people tend to read again today. He wrote far more than that. He wrote things like Lionizing and Why the Little Frenchman Has His Arm in a Sling. These are very funny stories, but people aren't reading those. They are reading the horror stories. So I think people feel a little guilty in some cases for enjoying some of these tales, and in a way it lets them feel more elevated if they can blame Poe for it.
I do want to say that, you know, Poe was a genius, and he knew it. And I think that made life difficult for him. People didn't like him because he was tough to take. I mean, he was a very, very smart guy. And also, he didn't mind making fun of people.
To their faces.
How quickly did he achieve fame? Is it The Raven that did it?
No, he was actually, I guess it was the Gold Bug, I think, that first really gave him a lot of fame. He was already somewhat well known as a critic and an editor, but the Gold Bug in 1843 was so popular that they had to print the dollar newspaper. It's been estimated that there were 300,000 copies of this newspaper printed, which is unheard of.
Let's take a Go ahead,
If it
Michael.
wasn't for the French, I don't think he'd have the reputation he has. If it wasn't for Baudelaire translating him. The French loved him, and I think that made him respectable here.
Kitty on the line from Baltimore County. Kitty, thank you for calling. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm just interested to know that nobody mentions that he had a terrible alcohol problem. Is that something we want to glide over? I have to tell you that I'm over 80 and that I had a very close friend who was a generation ahead of me, whose father, yet another generation ahead, was Edgar Allan Poe's doctor. And she said that, you know, they had the worst time with him because he would never pay his bills. What he did was he gave her father poems in payment. And the father would come home outraged and throw them in the fire. So the daughter, who was a poet herself and a rather remarkable woman, would sit in front of the fire trying to get them to come back into her dear little head. But nobody mentions the alcoholism. And also, on the positive side, I don't know whether it's true or not, but we were brought up in school, educated, that Edgar Allan Poe was the initiator of the short story, that prior to Edgar Allan Poe, there was no short story, let alone the poems.
Great questions. Thank you so much for calling. Let's ignore the alcohol part. No, just kidding. Let's start with the alcohol part. Jeff, what do you say?
I always say the Shakespeare people have to constantly deal with questions as to whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote the plays, and the Poe people always have to deal with questions of Poe's alcoholism. I think it is fair to say that Poe was an alcoholic in a technical sense. He certainly had apparently an unusual sensitivity to alcohol. A very small amount apparently made him quite intoxicated, and it was very bad for him, and yet he continued to do it occasionally. But he was not a chronic drunk. He was a binge drinker. He would have a moment of stress, particularly after Virginia became very ill, so he would drink maybe for a week or two, and then he wouldn't drink for months or even years. So its role in his life it was something he struggled with constantly. It is not a serious influence on his writings as far as we can tell, with perhaps some minor exceptions. But it's a genuine issue.
All right, what are we to make of this pseudo-controversy about which city has the most strongest claim to Poe? Is it Baltimore, because in Charles's story we have the body?
That's it.
Or Philadelphia, Boston, and so forth?
Well, I like to say there's plenty of Poe's legacy to go around, and we shouldn't be beating up on each other trying to score points, and we should be cooperating. It's certainly what the Poe Society tries to do. We've done events with Richmond, and I certainly am friends with people in Richmond and get a lot of information from them. I'm supposed to do a lecture in Philadelphia in a few months. At the Bronx Cottage is just a beautiful, beautiful little house where the bed Virginia died in is still in that house. So I think we should be cooperating and not necessarily emphasizing who deserves what.
Although the publicity is not bad.
The publicity has been very, very effective.
I think we should just all jump in and
I think
have
it's
more
fun.
and more events.
Let's argue about it.
Now, what's happening at the BMA? There's an exhibit that goes on for the next year or so?
We're planning an exhibit to open in October and run through December of this year into January of 10, which will feature some of the great works by these French artists, who, as you say, so early appreciated Poe. We're also working with the Enoch Pratt Library and Art on Purpose to have community workshops where people have an opportunity to interpret the themes of Poe's work through their own writing and visual efforts.
Anything, 30 seconds, that we want to get the word out about that the Poe Society might be doing?
Well, there are lots of things going on. Our chief thing is our annual lecture in October, but most things are being publicized through the website. So,
does the scholarship evolve on Poe, or we know all that we're ever going to know?
Oh no, we've learned a number of things. Very recently, an important document was found. Poe filed for bankruptcy. It lists people that he owed money to and the amounts that he owed. So important things keep popping up all the time.
All right, we have to leave it there. Jeff and Michael and Doreen, I want to thank all of you for being with us. We appreciate